We have heard since we were young, you had better behave, but how exactly does brain function relate to behavior? My name is Brad Ackerson, and welcome to the MCAT Science Review video on the influences on behavior, where we will learn just that. Our brain depends heavily on chemicals. We will begin learning about two important types of these chemicals, neurotransmitters and hormones, and we will end debating the age-old question, does nature or nurture influence our behavior more? Our learning goal for this video is to identify how neurons and their neurotransmitters affect our behavior, as well as different genetic and environmental influences that exist. Realizing this goal will enable us to answer MCAT-style questions such as this one about which neurotransmitter is released when we are startled. But don't feel startled yourself. This video will help us keep everything straight. First are the neurotransmitters, so called because they transmit information throughout our nervous system. These molecules allow us to take an electrical impulse traveling down an axon, and via a chemical signal continue that impulse in later neurons. More than 100 have been identified, but luckily you only need to know these 7 for test day. First are those that work in the central nervous system, dopamine, serotonin, GABA, and the endorphins. We will go over each of these in detail momentarily. In the peripheral nervous system, we have epinephrine and norepinephrine, and you only need to know one neurotransmitter that is in both the central and peripheral nervous systems, and that is acetylcholine. Now, let's go through these one at a time. First, in the central nervous system is dopamine. Take my word for it, you should love dopamine. It is the neurotransmitter involved in the reward or pleasure circuit. However, it can also be abused because the addiction pathways in the brain are dependent on it. Decreased dopamine levels are what cause withdrawals and other addictive behaviors. Serotonin has a variety of influences on behavior. It can change mood, influence our sleep cycles and appetite, and regulate our dreams. GABA is the brain stabilizer. Basically, it is inhibitory and keeps neurons from firing out of control, keeping everything stable. Last in the CNS are the endorphins, which kill pain and have slower and longer lasting effects. This is the neurotransmitter responsible for that euphoria that people feel after a marathon, when they should be crying in pain on the sidewalk. Next are the neurotransmitters in the peripheral nervous system. Epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, is our fight or flight neurotransmitter. The peripheral nervous system uses it to do everything from dilating pupils, allowing more light in, to increasing our heart rate to get the blood flowing. The norepinephrine, or noradrenaline, regulates our level of wakefulness and alertness. Again, you only need to know one neurotransmitter that works in both the central and peripheral nervous systems, and that is acetylcholine. In the peripheral nervous system, it regulates the movement of voluntary muscle, and in the central nervous system, it influences our attention and arousal. Like the neurotransmitters, another important class of chemicals that affect our behavior are hormones. The endocrine system regulates and distributes different hormones as needed. Here, we see an important structure in the middle of the brain, the hypothalamus. It is important to the endocrine system because it controls the release of the anterior pituitary hormones and synthesizes the ones found in the posterior pituitary. Let's take a look at the pituitary gland up close. The pituitary stalk is a physical connection between the posterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. There is an important difference between the anterior and posterior pituitary glands, and that is the hypophyseal portal system. As you can see, arteries lead to capillary beds. The anterior pituitary has 2 capillary beds connected by the portal vein. This is because the anterior pituitary is not connected physically to the hypothalamus, and therefore the hypothalamus regulates it through the bloodstream and this hypophyseal portal system. Now, which hormones do they release? The posterior pituitary gland releases antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, and oxytocin, while the anterior pituitary releases the flat peg hormones that you may remember from your biology classes, which are follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, luteinizing hormone, LH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, thyroid-stimulating hormone, TSH, prolactin, endorphins, and growth hormone, or GH. These hormones regulate many important bodily functions, such as the menstrual cycle and the thyroid gland. There are a few other endocrine organs to be familiar with. The adrenal medulla secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine and is located above the kidneys. The adrenal cortex secretes cortisol and sex hormones, and together the cortex and medulla make up the adrenal gland. Remember that renal means kidneys, so adrenal means above the kidneys. The gonads produce estrogen and testosterone. In the female, these are the ovaries, while in the male, they are the testes. Now that we have seen how chemicals in our body influence behavior, let's investigate this relationship between nature and nurture. Nature refers to genetically present or innate behaviors. Think, for example, of the mating rituals of some animals. When we see nurture, think environment. These are learned behaviors that depend on our surroundings. For example, a certain animal will change how they search for food as the seasons or environments change. But it is not just animals that are influenced by nature and nurture. Humans are as well, and we have studied this extensively. After all, wouldn't we love to know if we are a product of our biology, or to what extent our environment morphs us into who we are? These studies use families, twins, and adoption to understand how these two concepts relate. For example, monozygotic twins who are genetically identical exhibit much of the same behavior and personality, even when separated at birth. While that particular study argues for the nature side, when it is all said and done, these studies have shown that there is a balance between the two, and that most behaviors are influenced by both genetics and the environment. A particularly good example showing how both nature and nurture affect us comes from the basketball court, where tall people are generally considered to be more proficient. We might think that this is all genetic and their height gives them that advantage. However, we have to keep in mind that tall people are encouraged to play basketball from a younger age and thus have more practice. This is an example of how both genetics and the environment influence how we develop. Now let's see how the MCAT will test these concepts. Answer this first question about signal transduction. The correct answer is D. Remember that the signal is electrical until it reaches the synapse. Then, a chemical neurotransmitter carries the information to the postsynaptic terminal, where it will continue down the line. Answer this next question about nature versus nurture. If you chose A, you are correct. Breeding selects for genetics, which is innate, while conditioning, in this case, teaches a new dog new tricks, and they are learned behaviors. Our last question is about neurotransmitters. Take a second to select your answer. The answer to this question is D, epinephrine. Review the segments on neurotransmitters until you feel comfortable identifying each of their functions on MCAT-style questions. The most important things to learn in this video are the following ideas. First, neurotransmitters are chemicals that work with neurons to control behavior. Second, the endocrine system uses various hormones that affect how we act. And last, our behavior is due to both genetic and innate factors, as well as the environment that we are exposed to. Well, I hope your norepinephrine kept you awake and alert for this video. Thanks for watching.